Militia Money, Civilization as a Service. I'm going to go through the write-ups on militia money and its basis in property money, describing it as a civilization as a service, so that people can kind of get the idea. Starting with militia money is property money, defining its sovereigns, those who place their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization, as those who are registered for the draft. Let's talk about property money. Property money is backed by local property values as follows. Properties are protected by sovereigns when owners pay demurrage equally to sovereigns. We're going to have to go and look at what demurrage is. The property money essay in its entirety, it gets into the definition of demurrage right away. It explains it as follows. I'm just going to read this to you because it's very important that you get this. Property money is backed by the economy's total wealth. When the economy's total wealth increases, so does the supply of property money. When wealth decreases, property money supply decreases. Contrast this with gold-backed money. A customer deposits gold, and the bank gives him a gold certificate. The gold certificate circulates as money. The money supply increases when anyone demands gold in exchange for the certificate. The bank gives them the gold, and the certificate goes out of circulation. The money supply decreases. We'll refer to demurrage as the bank's cost of securing its gold from thieves, etc. Demurrage, remember that concept. Think about demurrage as the cost of the bank hiring a militia to protect its gold from thieves, etc. And more generally, think of demurrage in the context of property value as the cost society must pay in order to have a militia standing between chaos and civilization, thereby protecting property rights. Let's go back to the quick start guide and start describing things in a rather rapid manner. Sovereigns and demurrage rates, in other words, the rate at which the militia is paid for protecting civilization from chaos with their very flesh, blood, and bone, are selected by any criteria seemed suitable to the locality. The locality here being a society that agrees on some kind of criteria for its property rights. Demurrage on a property is assessed at its liquidation value in the local economy, or local currency rather. Liquidation value is crucial to understand what money is. Money is liquidity. When someone goes and liquidates a property, what they are saying is they are converting their property title into cash money. Cash money is liquid. That means you can go out and you can buy any of a variety of other things with it. Whereas if you simply have a property title, you can't walk around and simply exchange that for, say, groceries or gasoline or corporate stock. Now, here it gets a little bit tricky, but we have to understand exactly what is going on with property assessment in this system called property money, which is specialized into militia money, as described previously. Demurrage is assessed on all money except high bids in escrow. When the phrase demurrage is assessed is read, that should be read as a property is valued at a certain liquid value and is thereby charged a certain amount of fee for the protection from chaos so that civilization can have a foundation in property rights. Demurrage is assessed not only on property titles, it is also assessed on some money, not all money, only some money. The money that is not assessed, demurrage, is money that is in a high bid in escrow for some property title. In other words, let's say somebody has a house and there's a escrow bid for that house. Let's say the escrow bid is $200,000. That takes the place of, say, the county assessor's assessment of the value. The reason it takes the place of that is because the county assessor doesn't have to do an assessment of the market value of the house because there is a high bid in escrow. What that escrow means is the owner can at any time exchange the property title for that much cash. That means that the owner knows exactly how much the property is worth in cash money at any point in time when he might need to, say, under distress, get cash immediately for some kind of high priority need that he has to take care of. Say he has to go into the hospital or otherwise deal with some kind of an emergency. He can have a distressed liquidation of his property at the price that's in escrow. So we can get rid of all property assessments and all the politics involved in that and all the corruption involved in that by a simple market mechanism where property values are assessed by bids in escrow. The bids in escrow are the basis of property money. The money supply consists of all of the bids that are in escrow and all of the money that is not high bids in escrow, but may be circulating around. And if they are not high bids in escrow, they are charged demurrage just as though they are a regular property. The reason that only the money that's high bid in escrow is not charged any kind of demurrage is that it serves the purpose of property assessment. All other money that's circulating around or not high bid in escrow is charged demurrage or protection fees because it is not serving that function. Now, when a new property enters protected status, in other words, it is now within the protection of civilization as a service or militia money, money is created equal to the USD assessment. This is specifically for the United States in the transition. In other words, you go to the county assessor's office and you find out what the current assessed value of the property is, say in real estate. We're talking about local properties only at this point. We're not getting into higher levels of centralization of assets, like, for example, Twitter stock or something like that. So you can get an assessment to start out, and then you can distribute that property money to the local sovereigns as follows. When new money is created, it is divided equally among sovereigns. In other words, it's up to the sovereigns now to do the assessment of property values throughout the local economy. We'll deal with one more item here, which is important, which is application of property money to large jurisdictions is beyond the scope of the present Quick Start Guide. For example, there is no provision for eminent domain takings. Eminent domain requires discussion of not only the boundary between which sovereign will forcefully overrides older will, but also discussion of a more sophisticated escrow scheme that permits the same money to be placed in bids for multiple properties, any one of which may be taken by the owner, thereby removing the other bids placed with that same money. Eminent domain is a really sticky topic for people. The idea of eminent domain is essentially founded on the idea of civilization as a service. Whatever the sovereignty is placing itself between chaos and civilization, that civilization having its foundation in property rights that are protected by the sovereignty. This eminent domain philosophy is that there is a point at which the sovereignty may withdraw its protection from a property owner's title and thereby subject that owner to all kinds of threats to the property right. Instead of doing that, the sovereignty may instead choose to do some kind of a buyout of the title so that whatever kinds of benefits may accrue to the public by virtue of the fact that that property title now is available to the sovereignty can be achieved. So now we're going to go back to the property money essay in its totality and go down into some more details about how the whole concept operates. Let's now look at government as a bank that stores the economy's wealth. That store of wealth is the total value of property rights protected from thieves, etc., under law. As an exemplar, we'll look at the most basic property, a family dwelling. Building a new house stores it under government protection. The government issues a certificate known as a property title. However, unlike a gold certificate, the title isn't liquid enough to circulate. Recall what I said earlier, that you can't just take your house title and walk around and exchange that for, say, medical services or other kinds of emergency needs. You have to put it on the market, and if you're really distressed and need to get it right now, you're not going to get as much money, in other words, liquid money, cash, as you would if you could wait around a long time for somebody to come along that really wants that particular property. This is where property money comes to the rescue. Building a new house with liquidation value of, say, $200,000 increases the property money supply by $200,000 minus the sunk cost, say $150,000 of building it. The sunk cost includes, among other things, wealth consumed by the house, boards, nails, concrete, wires, etc. So in our simple example, $50,000 of wealth has been added to the economy. The property money supply thereby increases by $50,000. Thus, every dollar of property money in circulation is backed by a dollar of value in the economy's wealth. This essay describes how property money satisfies the demand for liquidity while privatizing the delivery of social goods. The phrases demand for liquidity and delivery of social goods is kind of technical, but it's pretty straightforward. When the economy grows, there is a demand for money to satisfy the need for engaging in transactions in the larger economy. The function of a monetary system is to issue new money so that the price of commodities or price of goods remains relatively stable, thereby communicating to people the meaning of a particular unit of currency. Now, agreed, there are a lot of times when you want to have that decoupled, but sometimes you don't want them decoupled. For example, when things are engaging in vital statistics like births and deaths. Let's say, for example, you have a total fertility rate that's declining in your society. What that's telling you is that the cost of replacement reproduction has been going up relative to the earning power of the families that are trying to survive and propagate into the next generation. This may be because of something going on in the culture. For example, you may have addictive properties in the culture that draw life force away from propagating humanity into the next generation. For example, if you have a government that is running around encouraging people to take heroin and then demands that they do things other than having children to satisfy their demand for heroin, then you have a situation in which the cost of having children has gone up. The cost of replacement reproduction has gone up. You obviously need to do something about that unless you are of the mind that you want to get rid of humanity for some reason. Maybe you're a transhumanist and you think that it's just great for humanity to get rid of itself and replace itself by machines, or you're an environmentalist and you want to get rid of humans because you think that humans are a blight on the planet, whatever. There are others of us who have a different view and different set of values. And those people are the people that I'm talking to. The rest of you guys can go ahead and we can have another conversation about where you fit into the overall scheme of things. I think you guys should like just get out of the biosphere and go into space, but we'll talk about that later. Privatizing the delivery of social goods. This is something that needs to happen if we are going to try to get rid of the political gamesmanship where people try to, say, for example, in communist countries, turn everything into social goods and then have a very centralized group of politicos that service themselves. There's a incentive on the part of any kind of central authority to further centralize power. And that incentive is recognized in ethics as a conflict of interest. In other words, there is a conflict of interest on the part of people who are central authorities to centralize more power and wealth. People who notice this conflict of interest and speak up about it have increasingly been called conspiracy theorists. Well, if you're a conspiracy theorist for simply noticing that there's an apparent conflict of interest on the part of central authorities to further centralize power and wealth, and that fact further makes you subject to, say, being put into an insane asylum because you're a imminent threat to the public or to yourself because you're crazy, that I think is a point at which you need to simply say it's time to decentralize by force if necessary. This is why I came up with the idea of militia money. So let's talk about the conventional monetary and fiscal policies that are relevant in the current environment. The conventional wisdom here is property money satisfies the demand for liquidity and raises its two big bushy eyebrows, monetary and fiscal. As I said earlier, the demand for liquidity is essentially demand for money by an economy that is growing, and you just need more money in order to satisfy the need to do transactions in the larger economy. Monetary policy and fiscal policy are distinct. Monetary policy basically talks about the money supply and the conditions under which you issue new money or take money out of circulation. Fiscal has more to do with the actual transactions of the economy and how you price things. Monetary. Conventional measures of money supply are a tiny fraction of the economy's total wealth. So property money seems to inflate the money supply beyond the demand for liquidity. In other words, we've just talked about the fact that the money supply in property money is equal to the total wealth in the economy. That is huge. It's far beyond what, say, the Federal Reserve talks about as the M1 money supply or other categories of money supply. So this is obviously way beyond what people normally talk about as a money supply. I'll just give it a little preview. When a money is a high bid in escrow for a property, it is not in circulation. It is locked in a particular role where it is not being charged a fee for that role. And that's why it will tend to stay there in reserve on that particular property rather than circulating in the economy. Okay, and then we'll talk about fiscal. By focusing on liquidation value, so-called mark-to-market accounting applies across the economy. In the conventional narrative, mark-to-market accounting caused the liquidity crisis of 2007. Mark-to-market accounting is something that you'll hear talked about when, for example, there was a recent bankruptcy of a cryptocurrency firm that once it was investigated by certain parties that were thinking about buying it, they applied mark-to-market accounting and the thing collapsed. Well, that happened back in 2007 and 2008 as well. Mark-to-market accounting is simply liquidation valuation of any kind of a property. We'll talk about the liquidity crisis of 2007, although that some people, that's ancient history. The more recent collapse in the cryptocurrency exchange may be something that people can identify with more immediately, but we'll talk about the liquidity crisis of 2007 because that was actually a much bigger event. Here's the conventional narrative of that crisis, the one in 2007, 2008. The liquid value of mortgage-backed securities collapsed. Major financial institutions were heavily invested in them. Regulators, following mark-to-market accounting, declared them insolvent. The cascade of failures caused government authorities to step in and inject liquidity. They did. Crisis over. That's the conventional wisdom's narrative. So mortgage-backed security is like, say, a stock, let's say, in a company that owns a bunch of mortgages. The way it makes its profits is by having a bunch of people paying mortgage payments to that company for their houses. Then that company has a stock value that is based upon speculation or some kind of accounting of how much revenue is coming in from homeowners to pay off their mortgages. So you can get these things that are called derivatives. You get a mortgage that is an asset, and then you can get a derivative of a mortgage, which would be a company that owns a bunch of mortgages, and then that stock in that company is a derived value from the various mortgages that have their more direct values. What happened in that crisis was there was a collapse in the apparent value of the stocks that were representing all of these packaged mortgages. And then those things fell apart. The big banks were invested in those things, and they were in danger. And since the whole financial system was tied up in these kinds of big banks, they were too big to fail. They had to be bailed out. The conventional wisdom doesn't much like discussing the fact that the resulting economic downturn foreclosed mortgages, kicking millions of families out of their homes and giving ownership of them to the financial institutions. Millions of houses went on the market. Some influential economists had the temerity to suggest the government tear down family dwellings so as to raise housing prices. The powerful institutions that demanded liquidity from the government wanted help in making their loan payments. They didn't want to be foreclosed. The government helped them rather than the families those institutions foreclosed. Government continues to inject liquidity to these institutions. Nowadays, they call it repo market loans. So in recent times, recent years, the Federal Reserve has been engaging in further, expansion of the money supply in the form of repo market loans. There's a lot of technical background, but that I won't get into. So they're still bailing out institutions in Wall Street. So here's what. The less conventional mind will perceive a curious opposition between the conventional wisdom's two raised bushy eyebrows. Property money policy oversupplies the demand for liquidity, and property money fiscal policy undersupplies the demand for liquidity. In fact, property money balances this polarity to satisfy the demand for liquidity. We'll now dive into that. Property money's demand for liquidity derived from its RNPV. Economists call the relationship between a property's liquid value and the associated demand for liquidity the risk-adjusted net present value of the property, or RNPV. That's a mouthful, but it's a simple concept. A property's liquid value is the size of a low-risk loan that can be paid off by the property's profit stream. That liquid value is the property's RNPV. To illustrate, let's return to our exemplar of the family dwelling. What is the profit stream of a home? What we're going to go through here is the way in which businesses, economists, etc., do a conversion between what, let's say, a physicist might think of as the difference between position and velocity. In other words, a physicist or an engineer has to think about a position in space as a different kind of thing, a qualitatively different kind of thing than is, say, the speed at which a car is driving down the road, changing its position. Frequently in political economy, people will talk about the rich, and they'll talk about the rich in terms of how much money they make per year instead of how much money they have. How much money they make per year can be thought of as more like the velocity or speed of a car. How much money they have can be thought more along the lines of the position of a car, where it is on a map. If engineers and scientists were to be as sloppy in their thinking as politicians and political economists are about distinguishing between wealth and income, rather between velocity and position as political economies are wealth and income, then we probably would not have anything like the modern technological civilization we have at all. And political economy, actually, if you look at it in those terms, there was this thing called the Domesday Book that was established back when the Northmen took over the Anglo-Saxons on the British Isles, that went around and assessed the property values of everything in the entire country. And that's actually a more rational political economy than modern economists are when they start trying to conflate wealth and income. But we'll go on and we'll start talking here about how rational business managers convert between flow or speed and the actual value of a property or its position in the economy. Economists view houses as does a landlord. One, estimate the incoming cash flow from rental payments by tenants, say $1,000 a month. This is a time varying flow or a through time flow as opposed to a position. It's like a velocity rather than a position. Adjust this downward, discount that incoming cash flow to the landlord to take into account risks of, say, the tenants not paying their rent, etc., say, down to $900 a month. So now you can't rely on the entirety of the $1,000 a month. You have to discount that to get towards something that's a low risk profit stream. 900 is closer to a low risk profit stream than it is 1,000, which is what is supposed to be paid according to the rental agreement. 3, estimate the business costs of managing the rental property as an outgoing cash flow, say $200 a month. So the landlord has to spend a lot of time and effort trying to make sure that things are maintained and managed in the property, dealing with paperwork with the government and other things of that nature. So that's an additional cost that has to be subtracted off from the rental payment to talk about what the landlord's actual profit is going to be. Now you risk adjust outgoing cash flow for maintenance and utilities upward. Reverse discount to be conservative, say to $250 a month. In other words, to get to a low risk estimate of the profit, the landlord has to assume that the normal costs of managing the property may be higher than the nominal costs, because there might be something that comes up as an emergency or something other kind of emergency that makes it so that the landlord has to pay out more per month to try to deal with the actual costs of maintenance and management. So now the difference between the incoming and outgoing cash flow is the low risk expected profit stream from the property. 900 minus $250 is equal to $650 a month. In other words, the risk adjusted income stream, which is 900, and the risk adjusted outflow stream, which is $250, are the figures that you subtract to get the net or profit stream. Now you have a low risk profit stream from that property. The landlord then asks, if I treat the low risk profit stream as a mortgage payment or as mortgage payments on the property, how much could I borrow at a low risk interest rate, say a 3% mortgage or a 30-year mortgage, which would be $154,000, $173. So that's the low risk mortgage that the landlord can actually take out and build a house to decide if he wants to go into business as a landlord. The size of this loan is called the risk adjusted net present value, or RNPV, of the property. If the investor can buy or build that house for less than $173,000, $154,173, then it is a profitable investment. This is true whether he invests his own money or borrows from a mortgage lending institution. The lending institution's demand for liquidity, and this is a key, because now we're getting to why it is that mortgage lending institutions got themselves into trouble. The lending institution's demand for liquidity associated with that mortgage is the lending institution's demand for mortgage payments. We're going to get into the word demand and how it relates to militias here in a moment. The RNPV calculation applies to all investments, hence to all property rights in the economy, not just housing. It even applies to the liquid value of mortgage lending institutions like the government-sponsored enterprise Fannie Mae, institutions that were endangered circa 2007 due to the liquidity crisis. I think it's important to talk about Fannie Mae specifically because it's an exemplar of the kind of thing that will happen under militia money, where you start to privatize the delivery of social goods. There was an attempt by the government to set up a government-sponsored corporation to deal with mortgages so that families could produce the next generation. Fannie Mae was one such government-sponsored corporation. It was an attempt to privatize, to some extent, the functions having to do with producing the next generation of human beings so that we wouldn't have to rely on immigration or robots or getting rid of humanity entirely, as some people would like to do, and even one of those three things. So the institutions that were endangered circa 2007 were endangered due to the liquidity crisis. Imagine every asset were a bank that holds property money reserves for its depositors. They may deposit or withdraw property money on demand. All assets taken together are an enormous banking system with huge reserves, one big reservoir of liquidity. What keeps property money soundly distributed across these banks? This I discussed earlier in terms of the escrows, but we'll get into that now. The government issues the landlord title to the house. It's a piece of paper, just like a property money dollar bill would be, but it's for a specific kind of legal right. The government asks for bids on the title. In other words, asks for bids on the property. Investors place bids in escrow. Property money deposits at 100% of the bid. In other words, a escrowed bid is for a $200,000 house that somebody wants to bid at $200,000 would require that investor to put the whole $200,000 into the escrow, depriving that investor of the ability to have that cash on hand to pay for things. This turns that bid into part of the total reserve in the monetary system. The high bid in escrow establishes the liquidation value of the house, i.e., the landlord can at any time liquidate the house by accepting the high bid in escrow, thereby transferring title to the bidder. This means that what we're looking at in terms of the liquidation value, it's the distressed liquidation value of the house. So assessments are at distressed liquidation valuation. These are going to be lower values than you would be able to get, say, if you were to put something up on the market and then wait around a while. So it's very important that people understand that assessments for protection requirements, like the demurrage that's on some kind of a property, are going to be lower than they would be under a non-distressed situation. A landlord or any kind of property owner can get immediate cash on demand, just as you can from an ATM. The government charges demurrage, remember that term, to the landlord in proportion to its liquidation value. Now, keep in mind, the use of the word government here has to be taken in the context of replacing the government with privatization of services. We're going to replace the government with a simple monetary system that provides the protection of property rights, the very foundation of civilization itself in property, through the creation of a militia that has every incentive to expand the economy and protect property rights. We'll get into that in just a moment. The government also charges demurrage to all bids that are not the high bid in escrow. The government also charges demurrage to all money not in escrowed bids. In other words, if the reserves, if these money reserves, the property money reserves, are taken out of the reserves and put into circulation, that money gets charged a fee for being in that state of circulation. And the amount that it gets charged is the same amount that is charged for the assessed value of any property in the economy. That is one of the incentives to take money out of circulation and keep it in reserves. The government, like the bank that holds gold in safekeeping, protects property rights. The cost thereof is covered by demurrage in proportion to the liquidation value. This is reminiscent of a property tax, but is more accurately described as a use fee for the government service of protecting property rights. In other words, civilization as a service. Applying demurrage to all property money except when part of a high bid in escrow means that transactions will shift property money between high bids and escrow. Payment processing institutions will be paying demurrage while executing such a shift. For example, let's say you've got Visa or MasterCard or some other kind of payment processing system like PayPal. If you have two parties to a transaction, they will probably be utilizing some kind of a payment processing intermediary like those companies. Those companies will be responsible for transferring money from one bid in escrow to another bid in escrow because that's how they make their money. They keep things in high bids in escrow, whereas consumer levels of transactions experience whatever kinds of fees that are charged by those private institutions, their payment processing institutions. This is the incentive to keep all property money as an up-to-date estimate of the liquid value of the economy. By liquid value of the economy means an estimate of the total wealth of the economy and also how much property money should be in circulation or should actually exist, not in circulation, but should exist. This is what keeps property money, hence liquidity, soundly distributed across the banks. Or in other words, it's what keeps property money in reserve with these high bids in escrow associated with the actual wealth that they represent. How property money meets the demand for liquidity. Recall the statement The lending institution's demand for liquidity associated with that mortgage is the lending institution's demand for mortgage payments. First, we have to clear out some confusion about the word demand in the vernacular versus the word demand in economics argot. In the vernacular, when I demand something, it implies an or else enforcement of my demand. In the law of supply and demand, on the other hand, demand is merely my willingness and ability to pay some amount of money in exchange for some product or service at that price. There is no notion of force. So, which of these senses of demand applies in the phrase demand for liquidity? Is it my willingness and ability to take something by force or pay for something I wish to take? The phrase demand for liquidity has the form of someone being willing and able to pay some amount of money to obtain some amount of liquidity. However, this is nonsense. Money is liquidity. So it is as though one is saying, I'm willing to pay you $1 of liquidity for $1 of liquidity. Now, what the lending institution is doing when its demand for liquidity is a demand for mortgage payments, is threatening to use force to extract that mortgage payment. Now we get into a problem in the foundation of the U.S. Constitution that is starting to exhibit itself in the present time, but we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll start back at this history. For instance, Shays' Rebellion resulted when lenders demanded payment on debts held by Revolutionary War veterans who themselves had not yet been paid for their service in the armed force. Being unable to pay in the form of money demanded, the lenders sent sheriffs out to, by force, take the farms of the veterans. This not only deprived veterans of their ability to provide for their children, it deprived them of the vote, since one had to own property to vote. I could go on about this for quite some time, but this is really the essence of what causes civilizations to collapse. When the people that might be thought of as the aristocracy become disidentified with those who actually are relied upon to enforce the aristocracy's will, you get a collapse of property rights and a collapse of civilization. That's why Shays' Rebellion was such a threat in the early days of the Republic. Since it was such men as Shays who had by force provided leaders access to the civil infrastructure, hence the very legal recourse they relied upon in calling in their debts by force, the structural absurdity is grotesquely apparent. The response was to call forth greater force with which to quash Shays' Rebellion. The richest man in America was George Washington, the military leader responsible to the military veterans. Washington, his aide-de-camp, Alexander Hamilton, and others saw the need for a federal government capable of paying its military veterans in money acceptable to lenders and quashing all rebellions such as Shays. The result was the U.S. Constitution. I could go into how to correct the U.S. Constitution with some minimum changes or amendments, but I think that we're beyond the point where that can be done at this point, and we need to go straight to militia money, even if it causes a great deal of disruption. So let's clear up this confusion about demand once and for all. Without those who place their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization, no one is in any position to demand anything but them. All demand originates with them. Any pretense otherwise, such as pretending sovereignty, resides with those able to raise the largest number of such men, is an arrogation of power that is ultimately as doomed as is a merchant wielding a piece of paper in a duel with a swordsman. I'm going to talk about this a little bit because I know that there are a lot of people who think of themselves as being able to raise a large number of men and enforce their will, entitling them to the idea that they're a sovereign, especially monarchists and things of that, people of that nature, but also people like the central bankers, and there are people who advocate for central banks like Hamilton. Um, there is a deal that was struck in the foundation of, I'll say, Judeo-Christian Western civilization during the Christianization of Northern Europe, wherein it is recorded actually explicitly in the Icelandic Althing, when it was officially Christianized. The same legal act outlawed holmgang, or duel to the death, as the appeal of last resort in dispute processing. If you have the pre-civil organizations or pre-civil societies of Northern Europe being civilized or Christianized, they gave up the individual's right to challenge a noble or one of the aristocracy or royals to single combat. This is so that positions of authority, permanent positions of authority, could be maintained, so that you could have something that it looks like a civilization. Now, this is a progressive process where you have more and more permanence in various positions due to a need for permanent posturing for war. If you're in continual contact with civilizations that have massive armies and can threaten mass warfare, you need to be in a continual situation of preparedness for mass warfare yourself. And that requires that you essentially be in a continual state of war. A continual state of war is one in which you can't have, say, some upstart challenging George Washington to a duel. You need to be in a state of peace, a genuine state of peace, in order to be able to tolerate that. In fact, George Washington himself, there are stories possibly apocryphal about George Washington having to deal with this kind of predilection among his officers and even some of the enlisted leading up to the Revolutionary War, to the point where he had to explicitly demand that his officers do not engage in duels. The reasons for that in a war machine are obvious. You can't have internal chaos like that going on because you aren't in a state where you have individual sovereignty anymore. The individual sovereigns are giving up. They're abrogating their individual sovereignty to be components of a war machine. Civilization itself has these characteristics about it. Part of what's going on with militia money is to recognize that each individual able-bodied man, especially young men who would be prone to challenge others to natural duel or duel in nature, are to be provided some substitute for giving up or abrogating that natural power of young manhood. That natural power is to be compensated for in terms of the demurrage to which they are entitled as men of draft age. That gets down into some pretty deep evolutionary psychology, but that's the general idea. It replaces notions of natural rights that are out there in Locke and others with a much more sophisticated and much more sound basis. So, with that in mind, let's talk about what such men demand of civilization as the only sound basis for talking about the demand for liquidity. The government monitors the cost of replacement reproduction. And remember, government is not what we see in Washington, D.C. these days. This is a very limited form of government. Nowadays, cost of replacement reproduction is dominated by the amount of money a woman can make by exchanging her most fertile years for gainful employment with the help of birth control and abortion. The more valuable her characteristics to the economy, the higher the cost of replacement reproduction associated with her socioeconomic cohort. To sustain intergenerational value, the cost of replacement reproduction must account for the fact that the economy has a structural bias toward removing from the next generation the characteristics it values in this generation. Now, some people are going to run around saying, well, there's no need to worry about that because genes don't matter and we can always educate people. Or, even worse, we can replace people with machines, or even worse, we just like get rid of people entirely and, whatever. I'm not talking to those people. I'm talking to you, young men, who know that you're getting screwed by civilization. And in your heart of hearts, you know that's going on. And you know all those people are full of it. Any lesser definition of the cost of living is a de facto act of genocide by the government against its own people. And by the way, it starts by devaluing the young, able-bodied heterosexual men in the society. And in particular, it attacks those young men who are most individualistic, because as individuals, they will tend to be at a disadvantage compared to folks who are more gang-oriented. And we'll get into why property money or militia money is a way of dealing with gang formation. We are now at the crucial issue of the delivery of social goods, so viciously inverted during the so-called bailout of financial institutions by the government. Families deprived of their jobs during the downturn were unable to make mortgage payments. Many were driven to bankruptcy and eviction from their homesteads that those institutions confiscated with government's help. Many of these held prime mortgages as opposed to subprime mortgages, but were lumped in with the irresponsible subprime homeowners by the vicious narrative of conventional wisdom. In a well-functioning property money regime, a monthly dividend is unconditionally and equally sent to those citizens who are responsible for placing their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization. Such citizens are sovereigns, as they embody the force inherent in any society. I'm going to talk right now about individual sovereignty in the militia money regime as distinct from, say, individual sovereignty as described by Davidson and Rees Moog in their book, Individual Sovereignty. A lot of people think that individual sovereignty means that you have money that you can run around in the marketplace and buy things and go, say, engage in jurisdictional arbitrage in the world with your money. That's foolishness. Sovereignty involves force. Just because you have some money, doesn't matter, you might even have Bitcoin or whatever, doesn't mean that you have lost your flesh, blood, and bone. You are still vulnerable to being killed. You are still vulnerable to being forced, especially by a gang, into doing things that you don't want to do. You have to get beyond the idea that individual sovereignty is based on money. If you want to have individual sovereignty in a civil kind of context, then you have to start coupling the flesh, blood, and bone to some kind of entitlement to the foundation of your monetary system, as described with militia money. We'll get into that a little bit further. Sovereigns possess the liquidity not only to meet their own mortgage payments, but to bail out their fellow citizens via their donations to the civic culture that once was the backbone of charity in the United States of America, fraternal organizations and churches. I talk about fraternal organizations here because people have kind of forgotten about those, especially since in the 1930s, one of the fraternal organizations, the Eagles Fraternal Organization, was involved in promoting the establishment of the Social Security system under FDR's regimes. That was a disastrous mistake by that particular fraternal organization. And all fraternal organizations have become relatively moribund, as well as churches in large measure. And I'll get into why that's happened with churches, but churches themselves need to be seriously looking at something like militia money to reinvigorate their young men and reinvigorate the families that are going to be producing the next generation of their parishioners or their members of their churches. In a liquidity crisis, sovereigns will indirectly bail out financial institutions according to the degree to which those institutions match the values of the civic culture of community charities. In other words, if you have a bunch of draft age men who are now the people who are dispensing the social goods, they are going to be making decisions about various businesses, charities, etc., that either match or do not match what they see as being of value. And what they see as being of value is going to be a function of the nature of young men, which is generally going to be, how can I go about getting my genes into the next generation? But it's going to be also constrained by the other young men in their community. And that's very crucial to understanding how we go about dealing with gangs and the invasion of gangs into communities across the entire West due to immigration and a variety of other pathological circumstances. What it boils down to is that you'll get a great deal of assortative migration under militia money, so that various communities of mutually consenting adults pursuing mutually consenting theories, moral systems, religions, values will emerge, and you'll have, once again, something that's more like a consenting society. When the cost of replacement reproduction increases, the government increases the demurrage charges, thus taking property money out of circulation via property owners. When cost of replacement reproduction decreases, the government decreases demurrage, thus putting money into circulation via the sovereigns. Now, when I talk about government again, this is essentially just the monetary system, and the decisions of these type can be thought of as a decision, for example, under the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. They adjust interest rates. There's a similar process that takes place within the militia money, where the militia is going to be replacing the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve to make these kinds of decisions. What about financial weapons of mass destruction called derivatives? Before the liquidity crisis, Warren Buffett said, derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction. Then they exploded, devastating families. The substance of Buffett's comment boils down to the fact that mark-to-market accounting is not structural, as it would be with property money. Derivatives bundle other assets together. Sometimes the way they are bundled is too opaque for a proper estimation of their liquid value. This is particularly true when debt or other liability is bundled together with wealth to form derivative property rights. Returning to our simple exemplar of home ownership, let's create a derivative that bundles title to the home together with liability for a home equity loan. In other words, there are two titles bundled together. One, a positive value to the owner of the home title, a negative value to the owner of the liability of the home equity loan. The new property has a liquid value that is derived by subtracting the liquid value to the lender of the home equity loan from the liquid value of the home. People normally would think about this as, how much equity do you have in your home? That's the liquid value of your home to you, because you have to pay off the loan to the home equity loaner. Under the current system, if someone wants to purchase this derivative, they must apply their own mark-to-market accounting to both underlying assets to estimate its liquid value. Now imagine a deregulated banking industry that can bundle huge numbers of houses and home equity loans into a single property derived from them. These are called mortgage-backed derivatives. Being deregulated, banks play fast and loose with mark-to-market accounting estimates of their real liquid value, and this is just the start. Mortgage insurance properties derived from mortgage-backed derivatives. Insurance of mortgage insurance, mortgage reinsurance, derives from mortgage insurance. High atop this pyramid of derived property rights, it becomes virtually impossible to see all the way down to the bottom to the underlying wealth in the economy so as to come up with an accurate liquid value for the total economy. Property money solves this by declaring any property that is protected by law to have a liquid value determined by its high bid and escrow. So we've solved a bunch of problems in one fell swoop by simply going to this high bid and escrow situation. Monopolies. Now, this is very important to things like the current social media swarms that are causing devastation and driving us toward possibly nuclear war with Russia, not to mention all of the abuses of people who are relatively conservative compared to the media monopolies in Silicon Valley. Finally, a word about how property money deals with private monopolies, since they are increasingly privatizing tyranny, censorship, if not punishment of individuals not compliant with orthodoxy. Property money, by using the liquid value of title to a business in assessing its demurrage, burdens monopolies with financial support of social goods via sovereigns. This is because as the monopoly profits become apparent to all, the high bid and escrow, hence liquid value, goes up. This may require a little bit of explanation. Let's think about it like this. If you, say, take Microsoft, when it first started up, it had this asset called MS-DOS. At that time, MS-DOS didn't look like it was all that valuable. And so the value of Microsoft wasn't all that valuable at that time. But as time went on, it became apparent that there were a lot of people that were using MS-DOS to write their software. So in order to get access to that body of software as a customer, you had to buy MS-DOS. This was like a tax on you, the customer, in order to be able to get access to all of those applications. If you didn't pay that tax, you couldn't get access to the applications written on MS-DOS. And then likewise, you had the IBM PC standard for the bus that provided this opportunity for lots of hardware manufacturers to come in and produce all kinds of cards that could be used to expand the capacity of the IBM PC. In order to get access to those cards, you had to, again, buy MS-DOS because of the fact that it was designed, rather those cards are designed for that particular bus, and MS-DOS was the dominant operating system that was used to get access to that kind of hardware. So you have this, something that's called a network effect that emerges, and as soon as you see a lot of software vendors and a lot of hardware vendors all requiring MS-DOS to be able to get access to them, now all of a sudden it becomes obvious to everyone that Microsoft has something like a monopoly. It has monopoly profits coming in because of the fact that every time there's a new customer of MS-DOS, or there's a new vendor for MS-DOS, or a new vendor for the hardware, there is increased value in MS-DOS itself. And this made Bill Gates the world's richest man for a while. So the liquidation value of MS-DOS's, say, copyright held by Microsoft went up, whereas, say, a competing operating system that might even have been superior, say CP/M, did not go up because it did not have that network effect. The economists call this a positive network externality. In other words, as the network of interactions between various vendors and customers grows on the same platform, then there are external consequences to any given business relationship. The external consequences of these relationships is that you have an increased value in the entire network. And so it becomes apparent to people that they should pay more money to buy from Bill Gates the rights to MS-DOS. Well, nobody got around to that because he wasn't going to give that up, because he understood that we live in a society where you tax income and not wealth. And therefore, he had a big win in just keeping control of this, say, taxing gateway for access to this entire network of items. The same is true in the internet age, where you have companies that have huge network effects all over the place that makes their companies very valuable simply because they have more customers. Social media is the most obvious example. As each additional customer comes into a social network, it increases the social network's value as a stock. So you have the liquidation value of, say, Twitter going up as each new person comes in, or Facebook. Likewise, other things like PayPal, et cetera, are also the same kinds of positive network externality capture by the stock value of those companies. They are all becoming very pathological because of the fact that because they are enjoying these huge monopoly profits, despite not really necessarily bringing anything that's of any further value, they can afford to start hiring people on the basis of something other than serving customer needs. And in fact, they will attract the worst kinds of people from the entire world. I mean, people who can smell this kind of monopoly profit power will just do anything to batter down the barriers to get into the country and take over those companies. And they did. And that's why you're seeing all this wokeness taking over our financial institutions, all of our media institutions, and all of our internet institutions. So getting back to this point here, if any mindless investor could make the same level of profit as the current owners of the business, the high bid in escrow increases to the point that those profits are siphoned off into demurrage. And what that means is that instead of going into the human resources department of these various internet monopolies so they can hire more studies majors from some university to come in and impose their diversity, inclusion, and equity requirements on whoever they hire and make sure that you have those ideologies. Now that is not going to pay those human resources people or the kinds of people that batter down the barriers of immigration to take over those companies. And instead is going to the young men that would be required to shed their blood in defense of those property rights. And those young men now are in a position to turn that money to, say, hire for themselves whatever services that they need for support of their local community, or even support their own fertility by outbidding the economy for the fertile years of the economically valued young women that might otherwise end up in positions where they had to spout this nonsense that had been put into their heads by their higher education and the resulting enormous student loan debt that can't be discharged even in bankruptcy prior to them even getting a mortgage where they could possibly bear children for the next generation's value. So bringing this down to earth, the demand for the most primitive property, land, that provides food and materials to house and clothe a family, enabling replacement reproduction, increases with the size of the economy. The more ways in which land can be put to use by civilization's economy, the more demand will exist for it. Quote, they aren't making any more of it, end quote, as the land speculator correctly believes. This is the most primitive example of civilization's so-called network effect, giving rise to monopoly rents. The connections between businesses in the economy form a network. The number of potential connections goes up as the square of the number of businesses. 1,000 businesses, 1 million potential connections. Each connection adds to the aggregate demand for vital assets like land. That arithmetic is not exactly right. It's actually n squared plus n, the quantity divided by 2, but we'll go into that a little later. The phrase land speculator has a bad connotation for a good reason. By purchasing a piece of land, he is enjoying the protection of that property right even though its value is increasing due to others' investments in growing the civilization's economy. This is why this is called an externality. He's enjoying the externalities of other people's investments. He can sit on vacant land and do nothing with it but reap the increase in its liquid value as civilization grows. If he puts that wealth to influencing government, he can even shift taxes off of land and onto the income of young couples trying to have children. They may be unable to afford to responsibly raise a family due to the cost of land. If that young couple represents the kind of responsible people required to protect property rights, there comes a point when they will cease respecting landowners. At that point, the top-heavy civilization crushes its weakened foundation, and civilization collapses. And that's where we are, folks. I use land as an exemplar, but there are many such network effects at work in civilization, and it is from these that civilization's power derives. Today's internet giants all rely heavily on capturing the value of network effects, just as did the original telephone network monopolies. Every new customer adds to the value of the network in approximate proportion to the number of other customers, because that is the number of potentially valuable connections. If a private entity owns a network of customers, as do, for example, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, PayPal, eBay, etc., the larger their customer base, the more unrealistic it is for any competitors to discipline them. As Lily Tomlin's character Ernestine, the phone operator, likes to tell customers, we don't have to, we don't care, we don't have to, we're the phone company. So if an investor doesn't have to care about his monopoly because he reaps the reward of civilization anyway, other investors will merely park their property money in the high bid and escrow for that monopoly. So now all of a sudden, his demurrage rates are going to be going up and up and up, because other investors are going to be able to see ways they can make money that are not going to be recognized by other investors. Eventually, someone will come along who has a better use for the monopoly, meaning he thinks he can turn a higher profit with it by, say, firing Ernestine and providing better customer service. He'll bid higher than other investors and thereby impose a higher demurrage rate on the current owner, who will be motivated to get out of that business and turn it over to the entrepreneur who, unlike the phone company, does care. Bringing this into the idea of force in more of a state of nature, think about these guys sitting on these properties and there's nobody to protect them. You know, for example, somebody says, well, Bill Gates, back in the 80s, I want MS-DOS. And he says, well, you can't have it because it's my property. It's like, okay, well, blam, you're dead. I just took it, right? I mean, there's a point where the higher the value of something is, the more you have to pay for protection of it, because of the fact that you're being protected from greater amounts of force that are willing to take it from you. And maybe for pretty good reasons. I mean, if you're sitting on something and you're, that's exceedingly valuable to a lot of people, and children aren't being born in numbers on the order of like tens of millions, as has been going on with like the baby boomers and actually the entirety of the West, and being replaced by immigration, boy, oh boy, you got to start thinking about why your brains aren't being splattered against the wall, because you are causing damage. And it isn't just like you just murdered somebody. You have committed genocide. You have committed de facto genocide. Even if you didn't intend it, you have, in effect, wiped out huge populations by virtue of the fact that you're sitting on top of these properties that have increased in value, that people become dependent upon, even if only because of the fact that there are women, young women, who are being seduced into thinking that they need these things by the way the current economy works. Sometimes you have to restructure the ownership of those assets so that you can start servicing humanity as opposed to wiping out humanity. The impact on internet monopolies would be to clean out the political animals who have latched their suckers onto those companies, there to indulge their whims regarding politics at the expense of the general public. This is very relevant to Elon Musk, who should be listening to this, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Meanwhile, the young men who place their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization will be reaping the network effects of civilization in the form of outbidding the economy for the fertile years of young women, thereby preserving for future generations the very characteristics demanded by the civilization. So let's go back to militia money. Now that we've covered what property money is, we're specializing property money to define its sovereigns, those who place their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization, as those who are registered for the draft. This definition overcomes a number of barriers to putting property money into practice. It operationally defines those who sovereigns are, thereby reducing rhetorical attacks by reducing the argument surface. Now, I have to describe what an argument surface is. An attack surface in cyber warfare, let's say, is how complicated, say, a computer system is. If it's very, very complicated, has a large number of nicks and crannies and other things that are called the attack surface that can be used to exploit it. An argument surface is, for example, if you take a large body of law, it can be thought of as a large body of software, as a large information system. And it has lots of little terms here and there, lots of loopholes, things that has terms that can be argued, the meaning can be argued over, it can be, a term can be shifted by rhetorical attack to try to make it so that in particular cases, it's biased in a particular way. And you can start to use emotive language that provides, say, connotations on words so that people can't really think straight based upon the lack of accurate denotation or accurate meaning to the words. The more you have things fuzzy, the more complicated you make things, the easier it is for sophists to come in and distort things and play politics and manipulate people's perceptions, etc., and try to subvert their rational judgment. Operationally defining things, what that means is that you don't have to worry about what the meaning of the thing is. You just look at how it operates. That's, for example, in the property money regime, you have the high bid and escrow. There's no argument about what the assessed value of a property is. It's there or it's not there by the operation of placing a bid in escrow. You don't go off to some kind of, assessor's office or, like for example, in France, they had a portion of their tax system that was based on wealth, and you would go in and have wealthy guys hiring lawyers to go in there and negotiate with the assessors how much their wealth was worth. And of course, that makes it so that you can't have that system work because the argument surface is so huge, and then it gets infected by people who are these, using weasel words and all kinds of other kinds of, lawyer type of manipulation, salesman types of manipulations. The next item, draft registration is a legally recognized class distinction. We are currently under an existing legal regime. It looks like it's heading for collapse, but it hasn't collapsed yet. So if people want to start to take steps now, they need to recognize the current recognized class distinctions. Draft is one of them. This class pertains specifically to those who place their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization. Obviously, people who are registered for the draft are registered for the draft in the military service, which is where they are going to be placed their flesh, blood, and bone between chaos and civilization. At least that's the purported idea or social contract that permits there to be a military and therefore draft registration. Finally, the mandatory nature of draft registration implies that society owes a debt to this class. Now, this is something that should be really obvious to people, but people are trying to weasel out of this. And militia money stops that weaseliness. Moreover, because the draft is currently restricted to men, militia money ameliorates the catastrophe befalling the developed world whose economies outbid young men for the fertile years of economically valued women, thereby depleting from the next generation economically valuable characteristics. As militia money is adopted, it is likely that the existing political entities will, using Israel as an exemplar, attempt to reimpose this catastrophe befalling civilization by expanding the draft to include young women. This disingenuous tactic will backfire for three reasons. One, Israel's government did not make the mistake of subverting the evolutionary psychology of its young women by rendering, in their mind, its young men manifestly impotent to defend their territory against the mass immigration of military-aged men who would be viewed as de facto conquerors by the primitive emotional brain centers of both men and women. Now, this gets to the heart of why mass immigration is so profoundly destructive to societies. Go back to the foundation of civilization, at least in Northern Europe with Christianization, when you outlaw single combat to the death, you make it so that the young men cannot defend their turf against invading young men. Forget about gangs, fighting gangs. Let's just talk about animal sexuality. A young man seeing some guy show up and says, "Where's your women?" He naturally is going to react to that by saying, "I'm going to fight you because you don't belong here. I've got land and I've got women around here, and you want to come in and share that. I don't see you bringing anything in for me. You might be bringing something in for some king or something like that, but not for me. So you and I are going to have it out now." Okay, well, civilization says to the young man, you can't do that, but the young woman's emotional brain can't see that civilization is backing up that immigrant man coming in. And her unintended behavior, but very natural behavior, is to start to see the immigrant man as being genetically superior to the young man that she might otherwise have had children with. And this is a contributing factor to the decline in fertility rates. It isn't the only factor, but it is a contributing factor. And it's also contributing to the deaths of despair of young men. It's contributing, I believe, also possibly to the testosterone decline that's being seen, at least across the developed world. Okay, number two, neocons and most members of American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, both played conspicuous roles in encouraging the West to make this mistake of immigration, and both are Jewish-identified movements/organizations. There's a lot of documentation on the role of Jewish leadership in expanding immigration policy into the United States. Kevin MacDonald's books, primarily The Culture of Critique, has a lot of stuff, and he has also some academic papers, one of which was published fairly recently, I believe, in an Israeli journal of philosophy, although I think they later retracted that. Three, awareness of both of the above will expand along with militia money for the simple reason that the evolutionary psychology of territory will begin to reemerge in the waking consciousness of young men, thereby remediating their self-esteem and freeing their minds from the taboos of the post-World War II era. The taboos of the post-World War II era are sometimes called Holocaustianity, replacing Christ as the innocent victim attempting to bring light unto the nations, with Jews as being the innocent victim, bringing light unto the nations. And we've got over 200 Holocaust movies. We've got like maybe I think one Holodomor movie about the Ukrainian famine. This has really indoctrinated the baby boomers to get rid of the Christian identity of their parents and adopt more of a Jewish view of the world and view Jews as the ultimate victims of any kind of attempt to defend territory. And that's just been a disaster for the West. The primary barrier to adoption of property money, hence militia money, will be the inability of property owners to recognize that property titles are founded on and granted by sovereign force. And we described that in some detail in the property money essay just previously. In discussing militia money with property owners, as I have done, by the way, the best way of helping them recognize this origin of entitlement, now here I'm talking about genuine entitlement, not this nonsense abuse of the word entitlement by the welfare state, is to ask them whether they would prefer that their tax revenue go to politicians or to young men who are registered for the draft. Although it is true that most property owners, particularly employers, will have a low opinion of young men generally, forcing them to compare with politicians may help them. I'll describe why employers have a low opinion of young men. Generally, part of it is because of the fact that, well, they're employers and they want to have a view of their own value as being higher than those that they employ because it's a bargaining situation. It's also the case that young men have been really gutted of their self-esteem. And there's, in fact, the consequences are coming home to roost in the lower life expectancy of working class white men as they age into middle age. So there's an ongoing problem. And in addition to this, you have the lowering of wages by the incoming military age immigrants that the employers will tend to identify with, regardless of whether that actually has helped them out in the long term. They will try to rationalize they made the right decision, and they will also try to rationalize that they are not harming or betraying those in their community by participating, especially the ones who are doing employing illegal immigrants, are betraying the actual foundation of law in their society. Those guys are in real danger. Obviously, as can be seen in the very wealthy and among employers who contribute to the Republican establishment candidates that are soft on immigration, some of these property owners will not be swayed. In other words, these guys have gone pretty hardcore into a state where they're going to be a problem. Moreover, they will likely recognize that militia money is a threat to them since they have sold out their people and their nation and will likely be seen as the traitors they are. But at least by offering them a comparison between the young men they despise or at least hold in contempt and politicians, you will have given them a chance to escape that fate. Other property owners will recognize the business opportunities represented by the privatization of all functions of government. These property owners will be among the new founders. A premier example of that is, let's take NASA. Privatizing space launch services was picked up by Elon Musk, and he ran with it. And he demonstrated, much to the chagrin of all these government contractors and government agencies themselves, that privatization of functions of government is the way to go, because you can then have genuine risk management under the role of private enterprise where risk management belongs. All manner of government services, all delivery of social goods can be so replaced if you channel the economic rents, the monopoly rents, etc., through the young men that are being called upon to defend the foundation of civilization and property rights, and to raise the next generation of children that are going to become the flesh, blood, and bone foundation for future generations, and therefore of property rights.